Book 19. The Church of the Apostles by Herman Melville. Chapter 1. And the lower old-fashioned part of the city in a narrow street, almost a lane, once filled with demure-looking dwellings, but now chiefly with immense lofty warehouses of foreign importers, and not far from the corner where the lane intersected with a very considerable but contracted thoroughfare for merchants and their clerks, and their carmen and porters, stood at this period a rather singular and ancient edifice, a relic of the more primitive time. The material was a grayish stone, rudely cut and massoned into walls of surprising thickness and strength, along two of which walls, the side ones, were distributed as many rows of arched and stately windows. A capacious, square, and wholly unornamented tower rose in front to twice the height of the body of the church. Three sides of this tower were pierced with small and narrow apertures. Thus far, in its external aspect, the building, now more than a century old, sufficiently attested for what purpose it had originally been founded. In its rear was a large and lofty plain brick structure, with its front to the rearward street, but its back presented to the back of the church, leaving a small, flagged, and quadrangular vacancy between. At the sides of this quadrangle, 3 stories of homely brick colonnades afforded covered communication between the ancient church and its less elderly adjunct. A dismantled, rusted, and forlorn old railing of iron fencing in a small courtyard in front of the rearward building seemed to hint that the latter had usurped an unoccupied space formerly sacred as the old church's burial enclosure. Such a fancy would have been entirely true. Built when that part of the city was devoted to private residences, and not to warehouses and offices as now, the old Church of the Apostles had had its days of sanctification and grace. But the tide of change and progress had rolled clean through its broad aisle and side aisles, and swept by far the greater part of its congregation 2 or 3 miles uptown. Some stubborn and elderly old merchants and accountants lingered a while among its dusty pews, listening to the exhortations of a faithful old pastor, who, sticking to his post in this flight of his congregation, still propped his half-palsied form in the worm-eaten pulpit, and occasionally pounded, though now with less vigorous hand, the moth-eaten covering of its desk. But it came to pass that this good old clergyman died, and when the gray-headed and bald-headed remaining merchants and accountants followed his coffin out of the broad aisle to see it reverently interred, then that was the last time that ever the old edifice witnessed the departure of a regular worshipping assembly from its walls. The venerable merchants and accountants held a meeting, at which it was finally decided that, hard and unwelcome as the necessity might be, yet it was now no use to disguise the fact that the building could no longer be efficiently devoted to its primitive purpose. It must be divided into stores, cut into offices, and given for a roost to the gregarious lawyers. This intention was executed, even to the making offices high up in the tower, and so well did the thing succeed, that ultimately the churchyard was invaded for a supplemental edifice, likewise to be promiscuously rented to the legal crowd. But this new building very much exceeded the body of the church in height. It was some 7 stories, a fearful pile of titanic bricks, lifting its tiled roof almost to a level with the top of the sacred tower. In this ambitious erection the proprietors went a few steps, or rather a few stories, too far. For as people would seldom willingly fall into legal altercations unless the lawyers were always very handy to help them, so it is ever an object with lawyers to have their offices as convenient as feasible to the street, on the ground floor, if possible, without a single acclivity of a step, but at any rate not in the 7th story of any house, where their clients might be deterred from employing them at all, if they were compelled to mount 7 long flights of stairs, one over the other, with very brief landings, in order even to pay their preliminary retaining fees. So, from some time after its throwing open, the upper stories of the less ancient attached edifice remained almost wholly without occupants, and by the forlorn echoes of their vacuities, right over the head of the business-thriving legal gentlemen below, must, to some few of them at least, have suggested unwelcome similitudes, having reference to the crowded state of their basement pockets, as compared with the melancholy condition of their attics. Alas! Full purses and empty heads. This dreary posture of affairs, however, was at last much altered for the better, by the gradual filling up of the vacant chambers on high, by scores of those miscellaneous bread-and-cheese adventurers, and ambiguously professional nondescripts in very genteel but shabby black, and unaccountable foreign-looking fellows in blue spectacles, who, previously issuing from unknown parts of the world, like storks in Holland, light on the eaves, and in the attics of lofty old buildings in most large seaport towns. Here they sit and talk like magpies, or descending in quest of improbable dinners, are to be seen drawn up along the curb in front of the eating houses, like lean rows of broken-hearted pelicans on a beach, their pockets loose, hanging down and flabby, like the pelican's pouches when fish are hard to be caught. But these poor, penniless devils still strive to make ample amends for their physical forlornness by resolutely reveling in the region of blissful ideals. They are mostly artists of various sorts, painters or sculptors or indigent students, or teachers of languages or poets, or fugitive French politicians, or German philosophers. Their mental tendencies, however heterodox at times, are still very fine and spiritual upon the whole, since the vacuity of their exchequers leads them to reject the coarse materialism of Hobbes and incline to the airy exaltations of the Berkeleyan philosophy. Often groping in vain in their pockets, they cannot but give in to the Descartian vortices, while the abundance of leisure in their attics, physical and figurative, unite with the leisure in their stomachs, to fit them in an eminent degree for that undivided attention indispensable to the proper digesting of the sublimated categories of Kant, especially as Kant can't, is the one great palpable fact in their pervadingly impalpable lives. These are the glorious paupers, from whom I learn the profoundest mysteries of things, since their very existence in the midst of such a terrible precariousness of the commonest means of support affords a problem on which many speculative nutcrackers have been vainly employed. Yet let me here offer up 3 locks of my hair to the memory of all such glorious paupers who have lived and died in this world. Surely and truly I honor them, noble men often at bottom, and for that very reason I make bold to be gamesome about them. For where fundamental nobleness is and fundamental honor is due, merriment is never accounted irreverent. The fools and pretenders of humanity, and the impostors and baboons among the gods, these only are offended with raillery, since both those gods and men whose titles to eminence are secure seldom worry themselves about the seditious gossip of old apple women and the skylarkings of funny little boys in the street. When the substance is gone, men cling to the shadow. Places once set apart to lofty purposes still retain the name of that loftiness, even when converted to the meanest uses. It would seem as if forced by imperative fate to renounce the reality of the romantic and lofty, the people of the present would fain make a compromise by retaining some purely imaginative remainder. The curious effects of this tendency is oftenest evinced in those venerable countries of the old transatlantic world, where still over the Thames one bridge yet retains the monastic tide of Blackfriars, though not a single Black Friar, but many a pickpocket, has stood on that bank since a good ways beyond the days of Queen Bess, where still innumerable other historic anomalies sweetly and sadly remind the present man of the wonderful procession that preceded him in his new generation. Nor, though the comparative recentness of our own foundation upon these Colombian shores excludes any considerable participation in these attractive anomalies, yet are we not altogether, in our more elderly towns, wholly without some touch of them, here and there. It was thus with the ancient Church of the Apostles, better known, even in its primitive day, under the abbreviative of the Apostles, which, though now converted from its original purpose to one so widely contrasting, yet still retained its majestical name. The lawyer or artist tenanting its chambers, whether in the new building or the old, when asked where he was to be found, invariably replied, "At the Apostles." But because now, at last, in the course of the inevitable transplantations of the more notable localities of the various professions in a thriving and amplifying town, the venerable spot offered not such inducements as before to the legal gentleman, and as the strange nondescript adventurers and artists and indigent philosophers of all sorts crowded in as fast as the others left. Therefore, in reference to the metaphysical strangeness of these curious inhabitants, and owing in some sort to the circumstance that several of them were well-known teleological theorists and social reformers and political propagandists of all manner of heterodoxical tenets. Therefore, I say, and partly, peradventure, from some slight waggishness in the public, the immemorial popular name of the ancient church itself was participatingly transferred to the dwellers therein. So it came to pass that, in the general fashion of the day, he who had chambers in the old church was familiarly styled an apostle. But as every effect is but the cause of another and a subsequent one, so it now happened that finding themselves thus clanishly, and not altogether infelicitously entitled, the occupants of the venerable church began to come together out of their various dens, in more social communion. attracted toward each other by a title common to all. By and by, from this they went further, and insensibly at last became organized in a peculiar society, which, though exceedingly inconspicuous and hardly perceptible in its public demonstrations, was still secretly suspected to have some mysterious ulterior object, vaguely connected with the absolute overturning of church and state, and the hasty and premature advance of some unknown great political and religious millennium. Still, though some zealous conservatives and devotees of morals several times left warning at the police office to keep a wary eye on the old church, and though, indeed, sometimes an officer would look up inquiringly at the suspicious narrow window slits in the lofty tower, yet, to say the truth, was the place, to all appearance, a very quiet and decorous one, and its occupants a company of harmless people, whose greatest reproach was efflorescent coats and crack-crowned hats all potting in the sun. Though in the middle of the day many bales and boxes would be trundled along the stores in front of the Apostles', and along its critically narrow sidewalk the merchants would now and then hurry to meet their checks ere the banks should close, yet the street, being mostly devoted to mere warehousing purposes, and not used as a general thoroughfare, it was at all times a rather secluded and silent place. But from an hour or two before sundown to 10 or 11 o'clock the next morning, it was remarkably silent and depopulated, except by the Apostles themselves, while every Sunday it presented an aspect of surprising and startling quiescence, showing nothing but one long vista of 6 or 7 stories of inexorable iron shutters on both sides of the way. It was pretty much the same with the other street, which, as before said, intersected with the warehousing lane, not very far from the Apostles'. For though that street was indeed a different one from the latter, being full of cheap refectories for clerks, foreign restaurants, and other places of commercial resort, yet the only hum in it was restricted to business hours. By night it was deserted of every occupant but the lamp-posts, and on Sunday to walk through it was like walking through an avenue of sphinxes. Such, then, was the present condition of the ancient Church of the Apostles, buzzing with a few lingering, equivocal lawyers in the basement, and populous with all sorts of poets, painters, paupers, and philosophers above. A mysterious professor of the flute was perched in one of the upper stories of the tower, and often, of silent, moonlight nights, his lofty, melodious notes would be warbled forth over the roofs of the 10,000 warehouses around him. As of yore, the bell had pealed over the domestic gables of a long-departed generation. Chapter 2. On the third night following the arrival of the party in the city, Pierre sat at twilight by a lofty window in the rear building of the Apostles'. The chamber was meager even to meanness. No carpet on the floor, no picture on the wall. Nothing but a low, long, and very curious-looking single bedstead that might possibly serve for an indigent bachelor's pallet, a large, blue, chintz-covered chest, a rickety, rheumatic, and most ancient mahogany chair, and a wide board of the toughest live oak, about 6 feet long, laid upon 2 upright empty flour barrels, and loaded with a large bottle of ink, an unfastened bundle of quills, a penknife, a folder, and a still unbound ream of foolscap paper, significantly stamped, ruled, blue. There, on the third night, at twilight, sat Pierre by that lofty window of a beggarly room in the rear building of the Apostles'. He was entirely idle, apparently. There was nothing in his hands, but there might have been something on his heart. Now and then he fixedly gazes at the curious-looking, rusty old bedstead. It seemed powerfully symbolical to him, and most symbolical it was, for it was the ancient dismemberable and portable camp bedstead of his grandfather, the defiant defender of the fort, the valiant captain in many an unsuccumbing campaign. On that very camp bedstead, there, beneath his tent on the field, the glorious old mild-eyed and warrior-hearted general had slept, and but waked to buckle his night-making sword by his side. For it was noble knighthood to be slain by Grand Pierre. In the other world his foes' ghosts bragged of the hand that had given them their passports. But has that hard bed of war descended for an inheritance to the soft body of peace? In the peaceful time of full barns, and when the noise of the peaceful flail is abroad, and the hum of peaceful commerce resounds, is the grandson of 2 generals a warrior too? Oh, not for naught, in the time of this seeming peace, are warrior grandsires given to Pierre. For Pierre is a warrior too. Life his campaign, and 3 fierce allies, woe and scorn and want, his foes. The wide world is banded against him. For lo you, he holds up the standard of right, and swears by the eternal and true. But Pierre, Pierre, when thou goest to that bed, how humbling the thought, that thy most extended length measures not the proud 6 feet 4 of thy grand John of Gaunt sire. The stature of the warrior is cut down to the dwindled glory of the fight. For more glorious in real tented field to strike down your valiant foe, than in the conflicts of a noble soul with a dastardly world to chase a vile enemy who ne'er will show front. There, then, on the 3rd night at twilight, by the lofty window of that beggarly room, sat Pierre in the rear building of the Apostles. He is gazing out from the window now, but except the dungeon form of the old grey tower, seemingly there is nothing to see but a wilderness of tiles, slate, shingles and tin. The desolate hanging wildernesses of tiles, slate, shingles and tin, wherewith we modern Babylonians replace the fair hanging gardens of the fine old Asiatic times when the excellent Nebuchadnezzar was king. There he sits, a strange exotic, transplanted from the delectable alcoves of the old manorial mansion, to take root in this niggard soil. No more do the sweet purple airs of the hills round about the green fields of Saddle Meadows come revivingly wafted to his cheek. Like a flower he feels the change. His bloom is gone from his cheek. His cheek is wilted and pale. From the lofty window of that beggarly room, what is it that Pierre is so intently eyeing? There is no street at his feet. Like a profound black gulf the open area of the quadrangle gapes beneath him. But across it, and at the further end of the steep roof of the ancient church, there looms the grey and grand old tower, emblem to Pierre of an unshakable fortitude, which, deep-rooted in the heart of the earth, defied all the howls of the air. There is a door in Pierre's room opposite the window of Pierre, and now a soft knock is heard in that direction, accompanied by gentle words, asking whether the speaker might enter. "Yes, always, sweet Isabel," answered Pierre, rising and approaching the door. "Here, let us drag out the old camp bed for a sofa. Come, sit down now, my sister, and let us fancy ourselves anywhere thou wilt. Then, my brother, let us fancy ourselves in realms of everlasting twilight and peace, where no bright sun shall rise, because the black night is always its follower. Twilight and peace, my brother, twilight and peace. It is twilight now, my sister, and surely, this part of the city at least seems still. Twilight now, but night soon. Then a brief sun, and then another long night. Peace now, but sleep and nothingness soon. And then hard work for thee, my brother, till the sweet twilight come again. Let us light a candle, my sister. The evening is deepening. For what light a candle, dear Pierre? Sit close to me, my brother." He moved nearer to her and stole one arm around her. Her sweet head leaned against his breast. Each felt the other's throbbing. "Oh, my dear Pierre, why should we always be longing for peace, and then be impatient of peace when it comes? Tell me, my brother, not 2 hours ago, thou wert wishing for twilight, and now thou wantest a candle to hurry the twilight's last lingering away." But Pierre did not seem to hear her. His arm embraced her tighter. His whole frame was invisibly trembling. Then suddenly, in a low tone of wonderful intensity, he breathed, "Isabel! Isabel!" She caught one arm around him, as his was around herself. The tremor ran from him to her. Both sat dumb. He rose and paced the room. "Well, Pierre, thou camest in here to arrange thy matters, thou saidst. Now what hast thou done? Come, we will light a candle now." The candle was lighted, and their talk went on. "How about the papers, my brother? Dost thou find everything right? Hast thou decided upon what to publish first, while thou art writing the new thing thou didst hint of? Look at that chest, my sister. Sayest thou not that the cords are yet untied? Then thou hast not been into it at all as yet?" "Not at all, Isabel. In 10 days I have lived 10,000 years. Forewarned now of the rubbish in that chest, I cannot summon the heart to open it. Trash, dross, dirt. Pierre, Pierre, what change is this? Didst thou not tell me, ere we came hither, that thy chest not only contained some silver and gold, but likewise far more precious things, readily convertible into silver and gold? Ah, Pierre, thou didst swear we had naught to fear. If I have ever wilfully deceived thee, Isabel, may the high gods prove Benedict Arnolds to me, and go over to the devils to reinforce them against me. But to have ignorantly deceived myself and thee together, Isabel. That is a very different thing. Oh, what a vile juggler and cheat is man! Isabel, in that chest are things which in the hour of composition, I thought the very heavens looked in from the windows in astonishment at their beauty and power. Then, afterward, when days cooled me down, and again I took them up and scanned them, some underlying suspicions intruded. But when in the open air, I recalled the fresh, unwritten images of the bunglingly written things. Then I felt buoyant and triumphant again. As if by that act of ideal recalling, I had, forsooth, transferred the perfect ideal to the miserable written attempt at embodying it. This mood remained. So that afterward how I talked to thee about the wonderful things I had done. The gold and the silver mine I had long before sprung for thee and for me, who never were to come to want in body or mind. Yet all this time, there was the latent suspicion of folly. But I would not admit it. I shut my soul's door in its face. Yet now, the 10,000 universal revealings brand me on the forehead with fool, and like protested notes at the bankers, all those written things of mine are jaggingly cut through and through with the protesting hammer of truth. Oh, I am sick, sick, sick. Let the arms that never were filled but by thee lure thee back again, Pierre, to the peace of the twilight, even though it be of the dimmest. She blew out the light and made Pierre sit down by her, and their hands were placed in each other's. Say, are not thy torments now gone, my brother? But replaced by, oh God, Isabel, unhand me, cried Pierre, starting up. Ye heavens, that have hidden yourselves in the black hood of the night, I call to ye, if to follow virtue to her uttermost vista, where common souls never go. If by that I take hold on hell, and the uttermost virtue, after all, prove but a betraying pander to the monstrousest vice. Then close in and crush me, ye stony walls, and into one gulf let all things tumble together. My brother! This is some incomprehensible raving, pealed Isabel, throwing both arms around him. My brother, my brother! Hark thee to thy furthest inland soul, thrilled Pierre in a steeled and quivering voice. Call me brother no more. How knowest thou I am thy brother? Did thy mother tell thee? Did my father say so to me? I am Pierre, and thou Isabel, wide brother and sister in the common humanity. No more. For the rest, let the gods look after their own combustibles. If they have put powder casks in me, let them look to it. Let them look to it. Ah, now I catch glimpses, and seem to half see, somehow, that the uttermost ideal of moral perfection in man is wide of the mark. The demigods trample on trash, and virtue and vice are trash. Isabel, I will write such things. I will gospelize the world anew, and show them deeper secrets than the apocalypse. I will write it, I will write it. Pierre, I am a poor girl, born in the midst of a mystery, bred in mystery, and still surviving to mystery. So mysterious myself, the air and the earth are unutterable to me. No word have I to express them. But these are the circumambient mysteries. Thy words, thy thoughts, open other wonder worlds to me, whither by myself I might fear to go. But trust to me, Pierre. With thee, I would boldly swim a starless sea, and be buoy to thee there, when thou the strong swimmer shouldst faint. Thou, Pierre, speakest of virtue and vice. Life-secluded Isabel knows neither the one nor the other, but by hearsay. What are they in their real selves, Pierre? Tell me first what is virtue. Begin! If on that point the gods are dumb, shall a pygmy speak? Ask the air. Then virtue is nothing. Not that. Then vice. Look, a nothing is the substance. It casts one shadow one way, and another the other way, and these two shadows cast from one nothing. These, seems to me, are virtue and vice. Then why torment thyself so, dearest Pierre? It is the law. What? That a nothing should torment a nothing. For I am a nothing. It is all a dream, we dream that we dreamed we dream. Pierre, when thou just hovered on the verge, thou wert a riddle to me. But now that thou art deep down in the gulf of the soul, now, when thou wouldst be lunatic to wise men, perhaps, now doth poor ignorant Isabel begin to comprehend thee. Thy feeling hath long been mine, Pierre. Long loneliness and anguish have opened miracles to me. Yes, it is all a dream. Swiftly he caught her in his arms. From nothing proceeds nothing, Isabel. How can one sin in a dream? First, what is sin, Pierre? Another name for the other name, Isabel. For virtue, Pierre? No, for vice. Let us sit down again, my brother. I am Pierre. Let us sit down again, Pierre. Sit close. Thy arm. And so, on the third night, when the twilight was gone, and no lamp was lit, within the lofty window of that beggarly room, sat Pierre and Isabel hushed. Book 20. Charlie Millthorpe by Herman Melville. Chapter 1. Pierre had been induced to take chambers at the Apostles', by one of the Apostles themselves, an old acquaintance of his, and a native of Saddle Meadows. Millthorpe was the son of a very respectable farmer, now dead, of more than common intelligence, and whose bowed shoulders and homely garb had still been surmounted by a head fit for a Greek philosopher, and features so fine and regular that they would have well graced an opulent gentleman. The political and social levelings and confoundings of all manner of human elements in America produce many striking individual anomalies unknown in other lands. Pierre well remembered old Farmer Millthorpe, the handsome, melancholy, calm-tempered, mute old man, in whose countenance, refinedly ennobled by nature, and yet coarsely tanned and attenuated by many a prolonged day's work in the harvest, rusticity and classicalness were strangely united. The delicate profile of his face bespoke the loftiest aristocracy. His knobbed and bony hands resembled a beggar's. Though for several generations the Millthorpes had lived on the Glendinning lands, they loosely and unostentatiously traced their origin to an emigrating English knight, who had crossed the sea in the time of the elder Charles. But that indigence which had prompted the knight to forsake his courtly country for the howling wilderness was the only remaining hereditament left to his bedwindled descendants in the fourth and fifth remove. At the time that Pierre first recollected this interesting man, he had, a year or two previous, abandoned an ample farm on account of absolute inability to meet the manorial rent, and was become the occupant of a very poor and contracted little place, on which was a small and half-ruinous house. There he then harbored with his wife, a very gentle and retiring person, his 3 little daughters, and his only son, a lad of Pierre's own age. The hereditary beauty and youthful bloom of this boy, his sweetness of temper, and something of natural refinement as contrasted with the unrelieved rudeness and oftentimes sordidness of his neighbors. These things had early attracted the sympathetic, spontaneous friendliness of Pierre. They were often wont to take their boyish rambles together, and even the severely critical Mrs. Glendinning, always fastidiously cautious as to the companions of Pierre, had never objected to his intimacy with so prepossessing and handsome a rustic as Charles. Boys are often very swiftly acute in forming a judgment on character. The lads had not long companioned ere Pierre concluded that however fine his face and sweet his temper, young Millthorpe was but little vigorous in mind, besides possessing a certain constitutional sophomorian presumption and egotism, which, however, having nothing to feed on but his father's meal and potatoes, and his own essentially timid and humane disposition, merely presented an amusing and harmless, though incurable, anomalous feature in his character, not at all impairing the good will and companionableness of Pierre. For even in his boyhood, Pierre possessed a sterling charity, which could cheerfully overlook all minor blemishes in his inferiors, whether in fortune or mind, content and glad to embrace the good whenever presented, or with whatever conjoined. So, in youth, do we unconsciously act upon those peculiar principles, which in conscious and verbalized maxims shall systematically regulate our maturer lives. A fact which forcibly illustrates the necessitarian dependence of our lives, and their subordination not to ourselves but to fate. If the grown man of taste possess not only some eye to detect the picturesque in the natural landscape, so also has he as keen a perception of what may not unfitly be here styled the povertiresque in the social landscape. To such an one, not more picturesquely conspicuous is the dismantled thatch in a painted cottage of Gainsborough than the time-tangled and want-thinned locks of a beggar, povertiresquely diversifying those snug little cabinet pictures of the world, which, exquisitely varnished and framed, are hung up in the drawing-room minds of humane men of taste and amiable philosophers of either the compensation or optimist school. They deny that any misery is in the world, except for the purpose of throwing the fine povertiresque element into its general picture. Go God hath deposited cash in the bank subject to our gentlemanly order. He hath bounteously blessed the world with a summer carpet of green. Begone, Heraclitus! The lamentations of the rain are but to make us our rainbows. Not that in equivocal reference to the povertiresque old farmer Millthorpe, Pierre is here intended to be hinted at. Still, man cannot wholly escape his surroundings. Unconsciously, Mrs. Glendinning had always been one of these curious optimists, and in his boyish life Pierre had not wholly escaped the maternal contagion. Yet often, in calling at the old farmer's for Charles of some early winter mornings, and meeting the painfully embarrassed, thin, feeble features of Mrs. Millthorpe, and the sadly inquisitive and hopelessly half-envious glances of the three little girls, and standing on the threshold Pierre would catch low, aged, life-weary groans from a recess out of sight from the door. Then would Pierre have some boyish inklings of something else than the pure povertiresque in poverty. Some inklings of what it might be, to be old and poor and worn and rheumatic, with shivering death drawing nigh, and present life itself but a dull and a chill. Some inklings of what it might be, for him who in youth had vivaciously leaped from his bed, impatient to meet the earliest sun, and lose no sweet drop of his life, now hating the beams he once so dearly loved, turning round in his bed to the wall to avoid them, and still postponing the foot which should bring him back to the dismal day, when the sun is not gold but copper, and the sky is not blue but gray, and the blood, like Rhenish wine, too long unquaffed by death, grows thin and sour in the veins. Pierre had not forgotten that the augmented penury of the Millthorpes was, at the time we now retrospectively treat of, gravely imputed by the gossiping frequenters of the Black Swan Inn to certain insinuated moral derelictions of the farmer. The old man tipped his elbow too often, once said in Pierre's hearing an old bottle-necked fellow, performing the identical same act with a half-emptied glass in his hand. But though the form of old Millthorpe was broken, his countenance, however sad and thin, betrayed no slightest sign of the sot, either past or present. He never was publicly known to frequent the inn, and seldom quitted the few acres he cultivated with his son. And though, alas, indigent enough, yet was he most punctually honest in paying his little debts of shillings and pence for his groceries. And though, heaven knows, he had plenty of occasion for all the money he could possibly earn, yet Pierre remembered that when, one autumn, a hog was bought of him for the servants' hall at the mansion, the old man never called for his money till the midwinter following. And then, as with trembling fingers he eagerly clutched the silver, he unsteadily said, "I have no use for it now, it might just as well have stood over." It was then, that chancing to overhear this, Mrs. Glendinning had looked at the old man, with a kindly and benignantly interested eye to the povertiresque, and murmured, "Ah, the old English knight is not yet out of his blood. Bravo, old man!" One day, in Pierre's sight, 9 silent figures emerged from the door of old Millthorpe. A coffin was put into a neighbor's farm wagon, and a procession some 30 feet long, including the elongated pole and box of the wagon, wound along Saddle Meadows to a hill, where, at last, old Millthorpe was laid down in a bed, where the rising sun should affront him no more. Oh, softest and daintiest of Holland linen is the motherly earth. There, beneath the sublime tester of the infinite sky, like emperors and kings, sleep, in grand state, the beggars and paupers of earth. I joy that death is this democrat, and hopeless of all other real and permanent democracies, still hug the thought that though in life some heads are crowned with gold, and some bound round with thorns, yet chisel them how they will, headstones are all alike. This somewhat particular account of the father of young Millthorpe will better set forth the less immature condition and character of the son, on whom had now descended the maintenance of his mother and sisters. But, though the son of a farmer, Charles was peculiarly averse to hard labor. It was not impossible that by resolute hard labor he might eventually have succeeded in placing his family in a far more comfortable situation than he had ever remembered them. But it was not so fated. The benevolent state had in its great wisdom decreed otherwise. In the village of Saddle Meadows there was an institution, half common school and half academy, but mainly supported by a general ordinance and financial provision of the government here. Not only were the rudiments of an English education taught, but likewise some touch of belles lettres and composition, and that great American bulwark and bore elocution. On the high-raised stage platform of the Saddle Meadows Academy, The sons of the most indigent day laborers were wont to drawl out the fiery revolutionary rhetoric of Patrick Henry, or gesticulate impetuously through the soft cadences of Drake's Culprit Fay. What wonder, then, that of Saturdays, when there was no elocution and poesy, these boys should grow melancholy and disdainful over the heavy, plodding handles of dung forks and hoes. At the age of 15, the ambition of Charles Millthorpe was to be either an orator or a poet, at any rate a great genius of one sort or other. He recalled the ancestral knight, and indignantly spurned the plough. Detecting in him the first germ of this inclination, old Millthorpe had very seriously reasoned with his son, warning him against the evils of his vagrant ambition. Ambition of that sort was either for undoubted genius, rich boys or poor boys, standing entirely alone in the world, with no one relying upon them. Charles had better consider the case. His father was old and infirm. He could not last very long. He had nothing to leave behind him but his plough and his hoe. His mother was sickly, his sisters pale and delicate, and finally life was a fact, and the winters in that part of the country exceedingly bitter and long. 7 months out of the 12 the pastures bore nothing, and all cattle must be fed in the barns. But Charles was a boy. Advice often seems the most wantonly wasted of all human breath. Man will not take wisdom on trust. May be it is well, for such wisdom is worthless. We must find the true gem for ourselves, and so we go groping and groping for many and many a day. Yet was Charles Millthorpe as affectionate and dutiful a boy as ever boasted of his brain, and knew not that he possessed a far more excellent and angelical thing in the possession of a generous heart. His father died. To his family he resolved to be a second father, and a careful provider now. But not by hard toil of his hand, but by gentler practices of his mind. Already he had read many books, history, poetry, romance, essays, and all. The manorial bookshelves had often been honored by his visits, and Pierre had kindly been his librarian. Not to lengthen the tale, at the age of 17, Charles sold the horse, the cow, the pig, the plough, the hoe, and almost every movable thing on the premises, and, converting all into cash, departed with his mother and sisters for the city, chiefly basing his expectations of success on some vague representations of an apothecary relative there resident. How he and his mother and sisters battled it out, how they pined and half-starved for a while, how they took in sewing, and Charles took in copying, and all but scantily sufficed for a livelihood. All this may be easily imagined. But some mysterious latent goodwill of fate toward him had not only thus far kept Charles from the poorhouse, but had really advanced his fortunes in a degree. At any rate, that certain harmless presumption and innocent egotism which have been previously adverted to as sharing in his general character, these had by no means retarded him, for it is often to be observed of the shallower men, that they are the very last to despond. It is the glory of the bladder that nothing can sink it. It is the reproach of a box of treasure, that once overboard it must down. Chapter 2. When arrived in the city, and discovering the heartless neglect of Pierre, looking about him for whom to apply to in this strait, bethought him of his old boy companion Charlie, and went out to seek him and found him at last. He saw before him a tall, well-grown, but rather thin and pale yet strikingly handsome young man of 22, occupying a small dusty law office on the 3rd floor of the older building of the Apostles, assuming to be doing a very large and hourly increasing business among empty pigeonholes, and directly under the eye of an unopened bottle of ink. His mother and sisters dwelling in a chamber overhead, and himself not only following the law for a corporeal living, but likewise interlinked with the peculiar secret theologico-politico-social schemes of the Masonic order of the seedy-coated apostles, and pursuing some crude, transcendental philosophy for both a contributory means of support, as well as for his complete intellectual aliment. Pierre was at first somewhat startled by his exceedingly frank and familiar manner. All old manorial deference for Pierre was clean gone and departed, though at the first shock of their encounter, Charlie could not possibly have known that Pierre was cast off. "Ha, Pierre! Glad to see you, my boy. Hark ye, next month I am to deliver an address before the Omega Order of the Apostles. The Grand Master Plinlimmon will be there. I have heard on the best authority that he once said of me, that youth has the primitive categories in him. He is destined to astonish the world. Why, lad, I have received propositions from the editors of the Spinozaeus to contribute a weekly column to their paper, and you know how very few can understand the Spinozaist. Nothing is admitted there but the ultimate transcendentals. Hark now in your ear. I think of throwing off the apostolic disguise and coming boldly out. Pierre, I think of stumping the state and preaching our philosophy to the masses. When did you arrive in town? Spite of all his tribulations, Pierre could not restrain a smile at this highly diverting reception. But well knowing the youth, he did not conclude from this audacious burst of enthusiastic egotism that his heart had it all corroded. For egotism is one thing and selfishness another. No sooner did Pierre intimate his condition to him than immediately Charlie was all earnest and practical kindness. Recommended the Apostles as the best possible lodgment for him, cheap, snug, and convenient to most public places. He offered to procure a cart and see himself to the transport of Pierre's luggage, but finally thought it best to mount the stairs and show him the vacant rooms. But when these at last were decided upon, and Charlie, all cheerfulness and alacrity, started with Pierre for the hotel, to assist him in the removal, grasping his arm the moment they emerged from the great arched door under the Tower of the Apostles. He instantly launched into his amusing heroics, and continued the strain till the trunks were fairly in sight. Lord, my law business overwhelms me. I must drive away some of my clients. I must have my exercise, and this ever-growing business denies it to me. Besides, I owe something to the sublime cause of the general humanity. I must displace some of my briefs for my metaphysical treatises. I cannot waste all my oil over bonds and mortgages. You said you were married, I think? But without stopping for any reply, he rattled on. Well, I suppose it is wise after all. It settles, centralizes, and confirms a man. I have heard that. No, I didn't. It is a random thought of my own that... Yes, it makes the world definite to him. It removes his morbid subjectiveness and makes all things objective. 9 small children, for instance, may be considered objective. Marriage, hey! A fine thing, no doubt, no doubt. Domestic pretty nice all round. But I owe something to the world. My boy. By marriage, I might contribute to the population of men, but not to the census of mind. The great men are all bachelors, you know. Their family is the universe. I should say the planet Saturn was their elder son, and Plato their uncle. So you were married. But again, reckless of answers, Charlie went on. Pierre, a thought, my boy? A thought for you. You do not say it, but you hint of a low purse. Now I shall help you to fill it. Stump the state on the Kantian philosophy. $1 a head, my boy. Pass round your beaver and you'll get it. I have every confidence in the penetration and magnanimousness of the people. Pierre, hark in your ear. It's my opinion the world is all wrong. Hist, I say, an entire mistake. Society demands an avatar. A Curtius, my boy, to leap into the fiery gulf, and by perishing himself, save the whole empire of men. Pierre, I have long renounced the allurements of life and fashion. Look at my coat, and see how I spurn them. Pierre, but, stop, have you ever a shilling? Let's take a cold cut here. It's a cheap place. I go here sometimes. Come, let's in. Dear listener, we close the pages on another tale, a journey through words, imagination, and emotion. Here at the Falls Audiobook, where stories flow like a river's current, carrying you to distant worlds and uncharted depths. We thank you for joining us. As always, we invite you to linger a little longer. Subscribe to our channel to discover more stories waiting to be heard, each a cascade of voices, ideas, and artistry. And remember, every great story begins with a single word. Perhaps the next one will begin with you. Until our voices meet again, may your days be filled with quiet moments, rich pages, and the soothing sound of a story well told. This is the Falls Audiobook, signing off.